Thanks for coming. This is the first talk we've done, so I don't know if it will be a complete train wreck, but hopefully we'll have more talks in the future, depending on how this goes. But we have the artist, so far we're successful. There are some people here, so that's also a success. But yeah, James, it's really nice. It's really nice that we've got to show your work. James is quite an amazing artist, and over the past few months I've been interviewing him and getting to know about your practice, and it's a pleasure to have him here. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. By the way, I'm very deaf, so if I don't answer the question, I mean, you by all means ask questions. I've done this, but please try and speak as you would to someone with hard of hearing. I'm going to be about sort of 40 minutes or 30 minutes, depending how it goes. This is called Painting Along the Digital River, Painting the Digital River was a book I wrote some 12 years ago in America, and about a painter using digital technology, myself, in fact. So what I'm doing, these are sort of rather arbitrary sections, but I'm going to talk about my beginnings and how the process, but it's mostly a bit how I make pictures. Can you put the next set? Thank you. I actually started painting pretty young at primary school because of one or other odd reason, and I sort of actually started oil paint when I was about 9 years old. My older brother was a year older, won a art prize, in fact, although he became a successful banker later. And I copied every picture out of Oliver Warner's British Marine painting. So those were my beginnings. Can you put the next slide on, please? Thanks. So when I was advised when I was at St Martin's that I should take up being a forger because I had some sort of technical skill, but very little. I was lacking in ideas, I think. But I was very fortunate to be at St Martin's, and then I was at the Royal College, and I think I did this when I was still at the Royal College, although I didn't work there at all, really. But I was very fortunate in the people who taught me I did sculpture at St Martin's briefly, and was with people like Anthony Caro, and I was actually studied with Leon Kossoff, the very expressionist thick paint, and there was the beginnings of conceptual art with people like Gilbert and George, and I actually worked for an artist, Sol LeWitt, doing his wall drawings at that period as a student. Next. And then by 1972, I was in New York, and I was overwhelmed by the kind of paintings and work I saw there, and interviewed Robert Morris, who was there. So very briefly, next slide, please. Just want to show how one thing led to another, and with some others, I started a magazine called Art Scribe in 1976, and it was because the main magazines like Student International were not covering painting. It was there was a view then, and this happens recurring, that painting was at an end and we should be doing photographic or conceptual or performance or some other kind of art. So after about a year, we started with £70, this magazine, and then by the fourth or fifth issue, the others doing it sort of dropped away because we had to put our own money to it. So I continued editing, and this would be the 10th issue, and it became the main UK, well, one of the leading magazines in England, and we exported a lot to America. And you can see here, we had to have quite a broad remit. It wasn't simply just about painting. We got performance art and all sorts of things. But it became quite sort of successful, not financially successful, but the point is I was doing painting and this at the same time, which was very hard, but it gave me a certain prominence. And next slide, thank you. But my own work had been evolving from lots of things were in the air about sort of minimal art and what's going to happen to painting. Next slide too. But then in about 1978, I sort of made a big change, and myself and several others, and these would include a good friend Gary Ragg and Bruce Russell and Bill Henderson's, and I was asked to select part of the show at the Hayward Gallery called the Hayward Annual, and this is a painting I did for that. It's hard to explain now why this was significant. First of all, the Hayward Gallery and the Hayward Annual was a much more prominent exhibition. It had started because artists had protested in 1977, they weren't represented. And so it was a very politically balanced show. So you had, when I was in Hayward Annual, there was a figurative section, the abstract section, there was a conceptual section, and so on. But this was a painting that's 16 feet wide. I called it Lazy Afternoons because that was the exact opposite of the kind of mindset with which I did it. I was very neurotic. But this was shown about 12 years ago in an exhibition about artists who were prominent in 1979. And so you get, by this time, through the magazine, I was very much part of a milieu with older artists like Bert Irvin, you see on the left there. It's Nick Pope and Garth Evans here. And next slide, please. And one thing that in this earlier stages of my life doing painting, it got me to Australia. It got me to America and France and all sorts of places, but it mainly got me to Australia in 1983 on a lecture tour. I was an artist in residence as well in Melbourne. And my ambition was to get to the Great Barrier Reef, which I did, and I went to Heron Island, which is where David Attenborough filmed the turtles in the first Life on Earth series. And boy, was it fantastic being underwater there. This is a 10-foot wide painting, which was done after being there. And it was also a kind of proving to myself something, because I decided to stop doing criticism and editing, and I sort of resigned from editing Art Scribe after sort of 8 years, really, and cast myself off to just doing painting. It was not a great idea financially, because I couldn't get a teaching job very easily. I eventually got a job in Preston teaching half-a-day art history. But the one thing about this painting of 1980, would have been 84, was that underwater, some of you must know this, that some of the fish you see are actually phosphorescent. So there's this thing called the surgeon fish, which has got they're also beautiful, and how can I put it? Well, some people say, put your head under there and you forgive up painting, but it is, I saw manta rays, sharks, the whole lot. And the other difficult point about sort of doing a picture is most of them are hardly visible because they're camouflaged against the coral. Anyway, this was a sort of, without realizing at the time, it was my lead into a kind of more electronic kind of art. Next slide. And the first computers I used were, apart from the BBC Micros, were the pre-runners of Macintosh called Apple II. There was no hard disk or anything like that. And this is one of the first programs you could use called Dazzle Draw. And you can see the resolution there is pretty crude. And bear in mind the screen would have been about this big and you couldn't hardly print anything from it. And and then a year or two later, I bought my own equipment, an Amiga and a very expensive printer called a Xerox 4020, the first kind of inkjet printers. And these were seriously expensive. I mean, a printer then, which would cost you about £1,200, and it would be now completely unacceptable in terms of quality. And you only had, I think, 8 or 16 colours. But what I did here was to cheat the system, because without any hard disk or with very little memory, you could only sort of the only what they called output would be like on the equivalent of toilet paper, about that big. So what I did was, it's hard to explain, I made a composition that you could never see because it would have 9 bits to it. But so you had to know, you do this one section and another section, and you had to do a diagram of how it would fix together. And I also put the printing paper over each other, so you would get extra colours through transparency. But I had a wonderful time, and this is another one. I knew that what you could do with these, by then I was using programs called things like deluxe paint. It was fantastic. I knew it was very limited, but I'd always done a lot of watercolors and gouache, and now I could do it at such speed and with such maneuverability. It was fantastic. There were lots of things that were probably wrong, because one thing I was concerned was to prove you could do larger work. So all these are about 1 meter across. Next one, please. And the other thing was that it was rather like taking drugs, which you shouldn't do, but your sort of world turns upside down, and what was certain before is no longer certain. And I was doing a lot of large paintings, 10 feet, and it probably set me back in some ways, because you could be so much less inhibited working digitally than you could when you're working with real paint. And because one simple reason is that every large painting costs quite a bit of money in terms of materials, and I couldn't sort of do 20 10-foot pictures in a morning, but I could digitally. Next. And then I acquired a digital camera. You may or may not know that digital cameras were really not available until the early 90s, and the first one I got was one actually Apple produced, which could only take 8 or 16 shots at a time. Can you go back one, please? Thanks. And this was a picture I did. We're using what was called a quick-take camera. This is, again, it's about 1 meter across. And using photographs within a paint program was a new thing, for me at least. And what I decided to do was to go to Leicester Square and photograph people who were carrying maps, or who were lost, or I went there repeatedly. And I sort of made a kind of amateur analysis of the kind of people you see there, who were Italians, who were Scandinavians. Italians do this, etc. And there were certain types of behavior that were quite interesting, because before mobile phones, if you were on a blind date, the best place to meet was by a phone box, because it looked like you were waiting for a phone call. So if you were stood up, you didn't look conspicuous. And I mean, you learned things like this, and the conversations you ever heard. But it was a sort of odd thing. But the odd thing was, by now the sort of first web available programs like Mosaic were there, and so I was on the internet, and someone saw this and got in touch, and they were from the BBC. Next, and so through this I got involved in a project in '97, working for the new premises for the BBC News. It never came to anything, because there was someone called Chris Evans, not the Chris Evans, someone else who was in charge, and there was also what was called Bert, who was the accountant in charge, and the whole thing was scrapped. But I had a fantastic insight into how the news is done, and I even wrote one word of the news, which is another story, but can you next one? But the effect was I had this sort of sense that the news desk, which was like an altar, and it was each sort of, what was then the 9 o'clock news, was like a religious ceremony going out to millions of people. And I wondered what Turner would have made of it, because it was like sort of in a plane over a city at night, and you have this sense of being in contact with so many things, and yet a story is condensed to 30 seconds. So I did some pictures which were technically quite difficult, but which were sort of a bit like this, with that sort of idea. In fact, there's a self-portrait of myself in here, slightly exaggerated. And also I took part in a quite independently a BBC program about self-made studios. And so there are two people. She's Janet Lee's in the red shirt, and there's Bernie, who were filming me with some of the first digital cameras. That was about 95. Next, please. Thank you. And the technical devices, I mean, what happens sometimes is you can have an idea you work on, and you think about that, but then you find a technical way to do it. But then you get involved, then you realize, oh, I've got something I can do here technically, which could be, I can forget about the ideas and just do it with that kind of depth and overlap. These sort of devices are now very common in programs like Photoshop, but this was before they were as readily available. Drop shadows, I had to do all that independently. Thank you, this is fine. And so the paintings I was doing were, I was sort of re-entering the kind of cliches of the School of Paris. I was kind of lost, but it was a good feeling. And this was a painting again, slightly smaller than that, but the figure was taken from a Turkish barber's, reversed, in negative. Next, please. And I was also drawing a lot, which I'll come to later. And I'm sure you know this, but when you work drawing digitally, you can do things like customize the brush. So you can be quite inventive with line, do things you can't do with a colored pencil, for example. So this is in Italian. When I say digital, all of these works are physical. They're all printed, the ones I sort of are showing. Nothing is sort of simply virtual. It's all has a physical presence. Next, please. And this is another 8-foot picture. And like I said, with a digital camera, the odd thing was you could... it was quite unlike a physical camera, where you had to buy the film and you would wait to get it developed. With a digital camera, you could see something... in this case, a swan in Camden Town, of all places. And with the same day, you could put it into start putting it in a painting. The swan is entirely... it's all oil paint here, and the swan is. So one thing, of course, with a digital image, you can analyze the color in minute detail. And the weird thing about the swan in the canal is one of the colors that's in that painting is orange, not a color you'd expect to associate with water. The other sort of point about this was there was a not particularly intended irony, because if you like, the more abstract forms are much more watery than the literal photographic one. Next, please. So this world I was in, I'd written criticism in the past and writing, and I'd had a lot of experience by now of conferences and clashes about using computers in painting, and been a lot in America and Germany. And one thing, I managed to persuade a publisher in America that I have a shot at a book, which was published in 2006 by Prentice Hall, which is part of the Pearson Group. It's about the only book published that was both in the art section and the computing section, which was quite in the computer graphics section. I won't talk too much about it, because the next slide, it's probably the only book on this category, computer graphics and art, that has watercolors at the beginning of each chapter. And my editor, who's in Boston, I just said, look, I've been going to the studio every day the 6 months I've been doing the final edit, and I just do paint pictures so I forget about this wretched book. But then I found that the pictures I was doing were horribly appropriate for the titles I was using. So he said, oh, well, why not? Next slide. So this sort of rather frustrated sort of watercolor that I was doing were at the front of each chapter. I want to come back to watercolors later. Next slide, please. Now, I want to fast forward to a different theme entirely, which is that I don't actually like having too clear an idea what I'm doing, or having to account for it. And luckily, if you don't, unlike if you're a student where you do all have to answer for your work, if you're just working on your own, you don't have to. So I've always thought I had to give a talk a couple of years back, and I thought, well, in case someone else says, where do you get your ideas or what it's about, I just say it's from the sky. Next, please. I'm a member of the RSPB, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and spend a lot of time at Minsmere in Suffolk. And then I would sort of... it's just that the way different birds fly and exist and what they do is just infinitely interesting. And I'm particularly keen on lapwings, which fly in a very distinct way. So this is the sort of one of the initial photographs I took. Next one, please. And this is sort of going in on it with putting a blue background. And the next. Now, before Christmas, it was I saw there was a project available to produce a very high in the Olympic Park. My studio is right next to the Olympic Park. There's a new building, and they were a huge 100-foot high hall, and there was a kind of competition to produce pictures for this, essentially. So I knocked this up. This is one case where this does not exist. That's sort of mocked up, and sort of put it forward. but I didn't get anywhere with it. But I thought, well, there's something interesting about this, so I played around with these shapes and birds for a bit. And next one, please. Lovely. And so you see here that I always do a lot of drawing digital without any purpose. And so the lapwings were fitting into this pattern. And then I worked on it a bit, and then I made a huge mistake. Next one, please. Which was this picture, which is next door. It was, what I did was repeated it accidentally. But I thought, well, that'll work all right. And at the same time, this was it was a commission for the London group, where I was producing lots of tickets for an auction. So this had to be sliced up into 64 different bits with different numbers on the back. So that's one reason I wrote the book called Painting the Digital River was that there were so many misunderstandings of what you can do with computers and art that I wanted to put, and I was confused myself, but I wanted to put on record that there were things like accidents involved, and it wasn't always impersonal. You could use nature or whatever. But anyway, next slide. And this is a painting of 10 years ago, where we can clearly see I was combining the underpainting, which is free painting, and the overpainting, which is taken straight from a projected digital image. There was a kind of saxophone shape on the left, which gave me a lot of bother. Next slide, please. You can see there that was actually shown at the Hilton Hotel, Trafalgar Square, in 2007. Gives you a sense. Next slide, please. And this was inspired by the Olympics I had parking permission to be right next to the Olympics, so I could walk straight in when I had a ticket for the diving. That was 5 years ago, and there was a tremendous feeling of optimism in the Olympic Park at the time, and this was sort of inspired by that, and by a tablecloth, to be honest. This is about that size. Next slide, please. Yes, and it was about, I could describe myself as a sports artist, because in 2009, I got a message and I thought, this has to be spam from Africa. It says you've been selected and blah, blah, blah. But I did reply, and it wasn't spam at all. I would been asked to produce a print for the World Cup 2010 in South Africa, representing the British team, English team, along with 4 other artists. And so there were weird contracts from FIFA about you couldn't have any footballer's profile because they're all sort of, you have to pay for that. So I did a kind of abstracted version of footballers. I did a lot of drawing and things, but I did it in the summer. Next slide, please. And I remembered I'd photographed these Soviet textiles in Boston from the 50s. And so I sort of cheated. I used some of the motifs and ideas from this. Next one, please. And this is sort of close-up. If you know anything about software, this is all done in Illustrator, which is a different kind of program, really, to what I usually use. I wasn't supposed to, I got away by putting Brazil in the middle, but if you know the colours. Next slide, please. So again, because I was doing, that was a fascinating project to do, which I made nothing out of. I mean, the company that set it up went bust, but I was next to North Korea in the lineup of artists, which was quite interesting. And my picture was right behind Sepp Blatter, the now disgraced Sepp Blatter, when they announced it in Cape Town. But it had the effect of some of the shapes and forms would spill over into paintings like this. Next. I don't want you to get the idea that I'm that romantic. I did a colour test on the internet the other day, a stupid thing just to waste time on Facebook, and about your colour sense, not your perception, but what colours you liked. I came out as 90% female, which I was very pleased about. But I mean, but some of the things that can lead to pictures are not necessarily particularly of that ilk. This plug, you can see, is the background to this picture. And the other thing I said from the sky, and I gave myself the project of whatever would appear in the sky when I was in Suffolk. I wanted to photograph a particular kind of Harrier, but what appeared instead was an Apache helicopter. So that went in the picture. So that's a kind of antidote to a lyrical kind of romantic approach. This is a more recent picture about a year or so ago that is a bit of a mess, but I'm also a great, get very excited by the night sky and a good telescope, so I just call this night sky. It's a large, it's about that size. Now, I want to go on to more about the process. And one of the things you can do on, next slide please, on what I've learned to do is, I wouldn't call it collage because it's not. With collage, you're using found material. In this kind of, this is again a physical work of about 2 meters across. I found myself making very temporary sculptures out of cardboard, like in the bottom here, which would only be up on the wall for maybe 10 minutes. But I'd photograph them and integrate them into this design. So the way it works is I would be photographing things in my studio at the time, lots of drawing done on the floor in paint, and then reassembling them digitally. This was also done that way. It started with a lot of drawing in the V&A Museum and of some Czech plates of all things, and then all the colour changed and I ended up like this. So my point is there's a process underneath all this which is to do with assemblage, if you keep on this one. But more recently, in the last year or two, I've been doing this a different way. I maybe get the reverse. I do a lot of drawings and very poor watercolors and things. So I use the reverse side of them, and I stick them up on the wall, and I do very fast paintings. I do another lot on the floor, and then I cut them up physically. I mean, that's the deal, that whatever you do is going to be cut up and thrown away. And I reassemble the next one into... can you get the next slide on? I put them, I both cut them up physically, first of all, and then here we go, and then I cut them up digitally as well. So I get this slightly cubist feel of, I suppose what I think it is all about is that I don't think for myself, I can compose very well, but if I make it accidental or use gimmicks of some sort, I can get a better result. So what I'm now doing is, these will be a series of pictures like, this is another one, this is from a blue source, this was large drawings in blue that I cut up. I call these ones portraits of blue. And so these both use the same source, and there are little bits and pieces that are actually digitally drawn, but on the whole it's using the kind of qualities of watercolour essentially. Because you can't assemble, the trouble with watercolour is you can't have dramatic contrast very easily in it. You can't have sharp edges, but you can if you do it this way. Right, I want to come on to watercolour because that's something I've always done. Next one, please. This goes back to when I was in Australia. I stopped in Thailand on the way in 1983 and borrowed some pens in the Bangkok Museum and did a lot of things. And I love the way they can use gold inlay in dark things. And so this is actually, more than 30 years old. But there's missed one there, that's one. But in the last few years, I do at least one large watercolour every day, and most of them are disastrous. But occasionally I get ones I can hang on to. And I won a prize for the Royal Watercolour Society 5 years ago, and been quite involved. I'm now actually the treasurer of the Royal Watercolour Society, which is a very old and odd organisation, but it's quite odd being part of that as well as being in the digital world, in the painting world. They don't always overlap. My colleagues at the Royal Watercolour Society will often say things like, I don't normally like abstract art, but Yes, but I feel very guilty because I spend so little time on watercolours. I mean, I do a lot, but I seldom spend more than 5 minutes on them. And they're mostly not done by me, but by the paint. But I've learnt a few things. We can stick on this one. Can you go back one? There's one of the things, there's an elderly member, I know I'm elderly, but even older, who I asked, I was asking about his technique, and he said yes, whether he worked them vertically or horizontally. He said, I work them vertically. And he's a very figurative artist, and he said, there are two ways of doing watercolour. You can either do them very, very slowly or very fast. And so I said, I'll do mine, mine very fast. But I also a lot of these were done on the wall and then on the floor afterwards, rather than at a slope. Next one, please. This is just a couple of weeks ago. I was actually, I've sometimes in my weird career, I've reviewed software for a computer graphics magazine, a high-end one selling very expensive stuff. But I was also recently doing a research I was testing some new paints, watercolor paints, which is a very odd thing to do, because most watercolors manufacturers, it's made for the amateur market. And the trouble is I don't use watercolor with much purpose in mind. I just see what it does. And I like to say to myself, I can use very cheap materials. It doesn't matter if but if you use some really good quality stuff, boy, can you get results. But the differences are so subtle that, I don't think you'd ever learn to do it. But I counted, I'm using something like 60 different colors here, but I don't do it with any kind of sensible process. I just take them at random. Next one, please. And this is a picture that's actually on show in London in the autumn watercolour show at the moment. This is actually combining both on the floor and vertically, but also I used shapes I'd found in my big drawn collage cut-about things so a lot of these elements are actually put in from being projected, so they would be sort of at random with what else was going on. You may think that can you go back a moment, that the splashiness of these is to do with being expressive or something. It's nothing to do with that. It's much more to do with that if you actually drop paint from a certain height, the pattern it makes has a logic to it that you can't do if you try and ever, it's like birds, if you try and do a drawing of seagulls, you could never do it because the way the seagulls or different species of birds group, especially things like jackdaws, where they pair off in the spring, is very distinct. It's not random at all. Every movement has a purpose. And so I really don't know what I'm doing here, but what I do know is it's nothing to do with being expressive. Next one, please. That's just the last sort of watercolour show. And so a lot of the work in this kind of watercolour is actually deciding which one you keep. It's not in having, I suppose there's a lot to do with the touch and the feel of the brush and that sort of stuff, but it's taking away your control or part of the control that gets in the way. So I think I learned a lot about watercolour from using digital things. Finally, the last section is just about sources. Next one, please. This is, again, I apologize, this is taken from the internet for a rare thing. This is from the Chapman drawing book of 1863. I do collect how to draw books. I've got a massive collection of about 150 now, from about 1880 to 1950. I don't know why I do it, but I've done it. I've started as a student actually doing it. And I love the images, and I love the kind of contentious prose you get with them. And in this case, I was just arranging these, and I thought, well, that's an interesting arrangement, and I'm stuck with this larger 10-foot painting. Next one. So why don't I just put that in? So in the background here, you'll see I've just simply copied that. It was alphabetical, so you get sort of sheep are next to yachts is one thing, ears and feet. It was shown at an exhibition commemorating about space studios, where I think I'm the longest running space studio since 1971, but it was shown upside down. And I went up to the attendant, and I said, I think that painting's upside down. He said, no, 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 the curator knew what they were doing. I said, yes, but look, there's a foot in the middle and some faces. No, 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 I think it's supposed to be. He's an abstract painter. I said, well, I did it, and I do know that. It's supposed to be the other way around. Oh. So they actually did turn it around in the middle of this rather gala sort of private view, but I was a bit sort of upset because you get sort of stereotyped, and how many people actually look at pictures? Couldn't you see it was upside down? Next, please. So what I had been doing for quite a while is stealing bits from my old drawing books and sticking them into pictures which got stuck in a way. And this is from a botany drawing book in the middle, reversed here. And this was about 10 years ago again now, and it ended up in the V&A Museum next in a show called Digital Pioneers, because believe it or not, I quite undeservedly qualified as a pioneer, although there's many people who are doing it all this a lot better and a lot before me. But it was very nice having a picture in the V&A for a while. These are some pages just from some how to draw books. These are from Walter Crane's of 1904. And the point about this is that it's very like the early drawing programs. You choose your size of brush and the qualities. So there was this sort of connection. It's sort of very technical. And then you get some really absurd books like Other Vase, my favorite chapter, Other Vases in Difficult Positions. I've always found ellipses interesting to draw. And next one, please. And then you have one called Speed from the 1920s, and of course, and speed would have meant a very different thing then than what it does now. So these are some paintings now which use sources vaguely related to that. This is from the lovely museum in Leiston in Suffolk of Steam Museum, it's called, and this is actually from a Ransom lawnmower. Next one, please. And this is quite a recent picture, quite large, about 7 or 8 feet across, which I call Life Study, but it's actually of an air conditioning unit from the 50s. This is about nothing at all. It's got a sort of tree in the middle. Now, finally, a couple of paintings showing you through the process. This is a painting that unusually started with acrylic for me. I almost always use oil, but this was, for fun, I used some purple and orange acrylic. I wanted to give myself a sort of problem. Oh God, did I? Next, please. And it got, I think, like other painters, well, the way I work is to react against what's horrible in the picture you're doing and try and make it less horrible and failing. Next. And this is, again, I was making these models in paper, and this is a digital printer, so to speak. And there was a shape there that rather interested me on the left, a cutout shape. And this next piece, I integrated this into this became up in part of this picture up on the left here. The dots are all done one at a time, manually, and it's a kind of vice I have. I just keep on doing it, I don't know why. And this picture wasn't going too well. Then I saw a fantastic exhibition of Sam Francis, his prints, and I thought, well, I'm going to steal that. I couldn't afford this print. It was really quite expensive, but I would have loved to own it. So I thought, well, I'll copy it. So I photographed it in detail, and I used what he'd done. Next slide, I sort of copied the idea into this painting. So you see this form, it's not exactly the same. I also love, I use very good oil paint, and I love the differences between some pigments. And this is the way the painting ended up, with a Marsh Harrier there on the left. There's a pigment called, can you go back a second? Yes. Called Italian umber green, which is kind of translucent, so that was very useful in this. So what I found interesting in this picture in the end was that, well, obviously I was using the Marsh Harrier, which I photographed at a great height with a zoom lens, because the Marsh Harriers circle like this, really high up. And you learn to spot them out of the corner of your eye. You can't see them with the naked eye. You need a telescope or a zoom lens, really, at that height. But I was using it as a device. I was cheating. It was a device that might solve the problem of the picture. But what the result was that you didn't, I think when you look at it, you're not quite sure. You could be looking at it from above, looking down, or you could be looking up from beneath. I don't want to go into, whether it's a landscape or not, or it's a painting. Next, please. And this was at the summer exhibition this year, Skied, right, you see up there. But I was very pleased to get it in. I don't often get in. I go in for most years, and I haven't been in for about 12 years. Last time I was in the exhibition, my work was given someone else's name. But now, next one, please. This is, again, an intermediary stage of a paper collage that's gone digital. It's both been cut about physically and digitally, you can see. And there's some motifs in this that are repeated deliberately. And next slide. This is a painting that was started out very pure and got sort of less pure. And so I used this sort of like a housey kind of form in here from that collage. I just put this in here. I thought it was wonderful for a while, and then I didn't. I thought it was awful. Next one. Now, this is a connection to Coventry. This last week I was at the Transport Museum, and I knew what I wanted to photograph, and I didn't photograph them very well, but it was bicycles. I took loads of pictures of bicycles. And what I did then, I used this, next slide, to, as an this is a digital version, which I would often do, of the picture in process. And I had the idea of using the kind of bicycle wheel forms to overpaint this picture. But I used a different, I used, in fact, an early motorbike in the end. That's the actual painting, which has got, is probably complete now, but it's a bit wet still. And to call it, I can think of titles for without any sense of responsibility, but I was listening to, I'm a great Berlioz fan, and I was actually listening to Cellini, don't you know that? And so I called this Let Me Be Cellini. He was the sort of mad goldsmith. Thank you, that's all. Next one.